Well, I assume to many of you who know me that you won't be all that surprised to hear that I have seen God on the other end of a telescope more than once in my life. One time in particular was unexpected. Some friends and I were camping during seminary in the White Mountains in New Hampshire, and those of us who had organized the trip had convinced our spouses that this wasn't going to be a long hike to a very remote place that would be hard to camp in. And so we got together and drove to New Hampshire, and the walk from the car to the campsite that was supposed to be 45 minutes, 3.5 hours later, turned out to be a lovely place to camp if you could find a campsite, or if there were indeed campsites where we had gone. So our spouses told us that they were going to sit and we were going to find a campsite. So we did. We trekked up and found a remote, beautiful place where there was what we thought were just enough space to fit a few tents. And we argued with one another, will this be enough? Are we going to be in trouble when we go back? And we decided this was a good place. We went back and got the gear, and over the next hours of our camping trip discovered that we had not planned well. We had not planned our campsite well because there wasn't one, and we hadn't brought the right amount of food or the right kind of food. We hadn't prioritized warmth or comfort because my wife and I ended up huddled inside our backpacks at the end of the night because we had forgotten that, as Texans, it's cold in other places. Here's one thing we did remember to bring: a 60-pound telescope. My friend Chris never goes anywhere without it. And we got up to the campsite, and he said, "Come, I think I found the perfect spot." The perfect spot happened to be, to us, in the middle of a pond, where he had instructed us all to take off our shoes and roll up our pants and walk almost knee-deep into freezing water in the mountains of New Hampshire, where he said, "This is the spot." We pointed the telescope at the sky, and for lack of better terminology, sat in perfect silence in the stars, like Whitman did in the poem, and just stared at God for a while. One interpretation would be that we had not prioritized the safety, comfort, or well-being of the people we love. Another, more charitable interpretation would be that we did prioritize awe and wonder. Even if we didn't bring the right kind of food or blankets, we brought a really good telescope. That feeling of awe is something I remember as a kid. Going out in my backyard with my dad and through a telescope in Grand Prairie behind our house, looking up and seeing the craters in the moon with my own eyes. Or as an 8-year-old kid staring up and seeing the rings around Saturn. Not in a picture, but with my eyes. I try to give those experiences to my children because they are outside of the more profound mystical moments I've had, the most religious experiences I can name. Seeing the mystery of creation in front of my eyes, things that were unavailable to people decades ago. I can see, you can see. Now, I describe those experiences as religious, knowing well that there are plenty of progressives and plenty of conservatives who would argue that religion and science have no use being in the same room together. This week, Stephen Hawking died. And in his death, we lost the insights and continual wisdom of one of the most profound physicists and scientists and, to my mind, poet-philosophers that we have. This man who became one of the most well-known proponents of the disability rights movement also taught us as human beings more than we ever knew about black holes and dark matter, or the way that all things that ever have been or will be function. It's a big task. He did it with grace. And I've watched in the days following his death as people on the far left and the far right both have tried to use his life and death as an excuse to perpetuate a fight that shouldn't have to exist between scientist and preacher. I've heard people in very conservative circles and blogs that I read and follow talk about the fact that because he had professed himself to be an atheist, he would be without God for all eternity. And just as offensively, I've seen fundamentalist atheists with glee take his quotes and then show how silly and small-minded other people must be because of what they believe. You see, smart people think like Stephen Hawking. And for me, it's much richer in the space in between those two places. There's so much evidence to the contrary. Like the fact that 20% of all scientists in the United States worship in a religious institution on a weekly basis, which doesn't seem that big until you realize that only 20% of people in the United States go to worship on a weekly basis. The Vatican has one of the best research facilities for astronomy and quantum physics on the planet Earth. The Vatican has a team of astrophysicists and astronomers. Half the objects on the moon are named after Jesuit priests. The Big Bang was first theorized by a Belgian Catholic priest in the 1920s. He noticed through his telescope that the universe was expanding at a more rapid rate, and he thought we must have all been the same thing at one time. He called it the cosmic egg. Isn't that wonderful? We don't have to fight. And anybody who tells you that religion and science are by their very nature in opposition is just fooling you. And so for the next 20 minutes at least, and I hope for longer, let's drop that premise entirely. And instead talk about what it would mean to have a relentless, passionate search for the truth. See, we say science is real in this sermon series, along with Black Lives Matter and Love is Love and women's rights are human rights. We're saying this as a religious conviction, unfortunately, because plenty of people say it's not true. There are people in positions of power and authority who, for power or profit, are denigrating science to our peril. And so it shouldn't have to be a radical thing to say science is real, and yet we do. But that's not really why we have a sermon about it. We have a sermon here, and it's a religious value for us because we have affirmed that the view of reality you get from a telescope is also Scripture. A canon is the collection of wisdom for a religion. Some religions have one book, one prophet, one tradition, and then you stop. We have those books, those prophets, and that tradition. We just never stopped adding books to our bookcase. Hebrew Bible, the Christian scriptures, Buddhist wisdom, the Quran, science, poetry, the New York Times, behavioral psychology, evolution, the Hubble telescope. In our religion, we believe that you might have a private revelation of God, and the rest of us also have a public revelation where we all look out and go, wow. We are literally pieces of the earth that evolved to a place where we could leave the planet, take pictures, and stare back and say, wow. The telescope says Scripture can tell us something about the foundational nature of reality itself and what it means to be a human. The battle doesn't have to be there. Those Vatican astronomers in a radio interview I listened to this week said that for them, astrophysics and quantum mechanics and cosmology are teaching them something they didn't know about God. See, we always view God through our lens of whatever technology or culture we have. In agricultural times, we understand God to be seen primarily through the cycles of nature. You watch plants die and give seed and be resurrected again. In the Industrial Revolution, theologians in the East and West began to talk about God in more mechanistic terms. God was a deist who had order and law, and you pull one lever here and something else very clearly happens over here. Now with quantum mechanics, and the idea that uncertainty and chaos are built into the very fabric of every atom that's ever existed, these Vatican theologians and astronomers are saying, maybe our beautiful God never writes an unfinished story. Maybe even God is unfinished and evolving. So I can do Vatican astrophysics theology. What are we learning about God from a telescope? See, every week we stand up here and we say that the quest of truth is one of our sacraments. Sacrament is the word that means to make unseen things seen. And you can do the search for truth as a sacrament very poorly. One really good way to ruin a search for truth is just to stop. I've learned all I need to learn, thank you very much. Everyone else is an idiot or going to hell. That's one way to do the search for truth really poorly. Another way is to deny what's true because it serves you well. And when we look around and see that people who are clinging to power and profit are denying science, it ends up with bad, destructive policy. It's bad for women's health. It's bad for environmental concerns. It's bad for economics. And if taken to its logical conclusion, this denial of science could end human life on Earth a lot quicker than it needs to. But my guess is you wouldn't be hanging around this church unless you kind of agreed with climate science. So, let's not focus on how other people are messing this up and instead focus on ourselves for a minute. There is a way that progressives can do a quest for truth poorly as well. And it often ends up looking a lot like arrogance. We are the smart people who get it, not like those other poor people who don't. I remember, and I've told you, that I moved very quickly in my adolescent years from fundamentalist Christianity to fundamentalist atheism in like 4 hours. And once I had left the church kicking and screaming and was convinced, and I had like Nietzsche and Marx quotes up on my wall in my bedroom. I was convinced that my job was to suck the life and magic and mystery out of everybody else's beliefs. My job wasn't to get people to look through a telescope with me and go, wow. My job was to convince them how ignorant they had been. You want to guess how effective that strategy was? Oh, you believe that you were created by an all-powerful, omniscient, loving, personal God who moves through the world with you and cares about you. Well, all of life is just a randomless, chaotic bungling of atoms together until, through our meaningless existence, we find finality in the cold, inky blackness of death. Ha ha. I know you say you're in love, but that's probably just a genetic predisposition to continue your genetic evolution over time that's fueled by hormones and will one day end. Ha! It's like reading The Three Little Bears to your kid and stopping halfway through to go, you know, bears don't talk, right? Instead of being like Walt Whitman and taking people who might have been bored in a lecture hall and going out to stare in perfect silence at the stars, to make the world magical, and it is. Thought my job as a progressive was just to ruin everybody else's time. To be set apart, smarter, one of the good people. We don't have to do it that way. When you do the quest for truth really well, whether it's through a microscope or through prayer, the funny thing is you kind of end up in the same spot. If you do both of those things well, you always end up saying, I don't know. Every good scientist tells you that if you study something long enough, you get to a place where you don't know. And then you have to study some more until you get to a place where you don't know. And if you stop, that's the only way that you'll know. We now believe that 75% of the universe is made up of something called dark matter, which is called dark matter because we're in the dark about it. 75% of the universe is probably made up of something that we didn't know existed 20 years ago. We don't know. One of the things I love about good science and good religion is that it does leave you in that mysticism. It says you, just as you are, with your own eyes and heart and body and mind, can experience something of the foundational nature of reality or God. And when you get there, you'll discover you don't know a thing. It keeps evading you over and over again. If you do the quest for truth really well, instead of separating you from the dumb people, what it does is connects you with the human experience. The man who currently leads the Vatican Astronomy Center said that when he finished his postdoc work at Harvard and MIT, he joined the Peace Corps because he believed that it was wrong to look at planets while people were starving. And so he told them, send me where I'll be most valuable, anywhere. And they sent him to teach astronomy in Nairobi. On the weekends, he would take a projector, an old slide projector, and hook it up to a car battery and travel to remote towns and villages to show people who had no access to electricity what galaxies look like. Hundreds and hundreds of people would cram into small spaces just to get a look at the stars. He said that he realized that he got the same oohs and ahs there that he did in lecture halls at MIT. It occurred to him in that moment that awe and wonder are not luxury goods. They're foundational parts of what it means to be a human being. In the poem we read by Adrian Mateka this morning, he speaks of being a young boy in Indiana in the early 1980s with a bad and poor public school in a poor neighborhood with poor parents. But he had the passion just from seeing the planets to dig through the garbage and maggots to find cans and bottles to sell so that he could buy a model of our solar system. In his memoirs, he writes that as that young boy, looking through a telescope made him believe that not only could he escape poverty, he could leave the earth. The quest for truth remystified his life, made him believe that more was possible than he saw in his own neighborhood. So the question for us as religious progressives who do affirm that science is real is, what will we do with our gospel? And is it good news? Is our task to stand on the sidelines and be very happy that we know what other people don't? Is our task to be right, or is our task to be effective? I would argue the latter, because the stakes are incredibly high right now. If we don't help millions and millions of people to fall in love with the God of a telescope, if we don't help millions and millions of people to fall in love with the ground upon which we walk, we might end up destroying life on our planet. If people don't fall in love with scientific discovery, the clouds and water and air will be more poisonous for my kids. The stakes of this gospel are incredibly high. And so instead of ripping the magic out of someone else's world, perhaps you and I learn to become evangelists of wonder and awe. Maybe we share firsthand experiences of awe and wonder through discovery that are just as profound and magical as any Sunday morning testimonial. Maybe we can tell the great story, the big story, in a way that sings. Is there a better story? Is there a better story at all? 13.7 billion years ago, all of us were the same thing. Every atom, every galaxy, every poet, every saint, every sinner, every pew, every animal, every trash heap, Every love, every death, every moment of amazement was all condensed in a very hot, very dense accumulation of matter that exploded in a white-hot explosion of hydrogen gas that, left to its own devices, became elephants and symphony orchestras and poetry. Death isn't a failure. It's built into the fabric of matter itself. It's how new life is formed. If you get sick and die, it's not because somebody sinned. It's because that's the way the world works. Cells die, and continents die, and planets die, and stars do too. You're connected in vast and mysterious ways. Half of your atoms came from a different galaxy. You're an extraterrestrial. Every time you breathe, you're not only breathing the same air that dinosaurs breathed, you're breathing them. And someone will one day breathe you. This place is incredible and mysterious and beautiful. And unless we share a gospel that makes other people fall deeply in love with this place and with discovery, it has a bad ending. But it doesn't have to. This gospel has tangible effects. People who believe that they are related not just to every person, but to cucumbers and elephants and rhinos and stars, treat their family better, the big family. Sometimes people who believe that they are made out of stars refuse to be treated like dirt, and justice happens. And sometimes a little boy growing up in poverty is so amazed looking through a telescope that he believes he can escape not just his neighborhood, but the planet. There's so much more possible than we've ever believed. And a gospel of awe and a God of a telescope can build a better life for us all. May it be so, and amen.